Christian, this is Crowland. We're a narrative gaming channel. We focus on how to get the best stories out of your RPGs. And today we're going to talk about dark fantasy, horror fantasy, grimdark, whatever you want to call it. So a while back I did a video on dark fantasy and the new weird. And this is a bit different because this is about horror. This is about fantasy that wants to mine the same vein as horror fiction to cause dread, disgust, objection, and fear. Now, over the years, the Wizards of the Coast especially have tried to do horror fantasy, and they never get it right. Because all they got is, ooh, here's some of our intellectual property, but this time it's got vampire teeth in. Ooh, a lich, but undeader. Ooh, it's a goblin and it's an eyeliner. That's always just, reskinning the monsters and some advice like, use a spooky voice. Now, I love horror fantasy, so I'm keen to talk about how I run it, which is, honestly, also because most of the fantasy games I run are somehow horrific. And the rest are set in the worlds of Piers Anthony and his rich and funny puns. Anyway, so I'll do a quick definition of what I mean by horror fantasy. I wrote about this a little bit in our book Wickerpunk, and our new book on Lovecraftian horror fantasy, which is coming soon. Stand by. Anyway, horror fantasy brings the monstrous into focus. You don't want orcs, you want leech people. You don't want dragons, you want floating jellyfish absorbing people into its mass. You want monsters to be monsters. And secondly, it's showing you a world where cruel things and predatory figures move. Bad things happen. But the fantasy part is that you have the ability to stop those bad things. You are the savior in the dark. You can't save everyone, but you can save some. And you can stop it happening to others. So horror fantasy isn't just the realm of what we now call edgelords. Although, I've been around for a long time. The edgelord phenomenon is hardly new. I think there's real psychological benefits actually to be had by safely confronting horrors that really only exist in the head of 5 people around a table and one rude bugger who's on their phone. I think that's why horror has a wide audience, It's about either safely experiencing something dreadful or the fantasy of being able to stop who experiences dreadful things. So, you're watching like Diablo 4 trailers and you're thinking, I would like to make my fantasy game scarier. Like, actually scary. There's a million dark settings out there these days, made by very serious Dark Souls fans. Not bleak or hopeless necessarily. I mean, scary. First of all horror needs a theme. You have to think about what kind of horror game you want to run. There's loads of ways to be scary. Body horror, of course, emphasizes physical suffering and unwanted transformation. Mutants from radiation storm the town. Your wife grows 100 feet. Your granddad grows gills. Your grandson is a monkey. Anything that emphasizes deformation, decay, generally suffering an insult to your bodily autonomy. In fantasy terms, they can mean a horrible plague, turning everyone into monsters, enemies, races that are extreme to extreme body mods, Cenobite style. Pathfinder actually seems to be rather obsessed with this. Tortured by dark elves, turned to an ableist little scumboy. Just body horror. Cosmic horror, right? We've got a book going, we're about to bring out a book all about this, but spoilers, cosmic horror is knowing you can never win. The universe is so large and filled with creatures who are so powerful that being the mightiest mortal hero is like being the mightiest ant in the pile to a big man. Typically, this is achieved through potent and bizarre monsters, a theme of hybridity. Like, none of the monsters are just, a thing in and of itself. They're always combinations of existing things. And there's an emphasis on terror rather than horror. More on that later. Gothic is... Real Gothic fiction doesn't make it a fantasy often. Maybe in Gormenghast? You ever read the Gormenghast books? They're amazing. There's a bad TV show of it. But it doesn't matter because Gothic horror is easy to do if you just want to do it broadly. If you've ever seen the vampire books from Warhammer Fantasy, or played Darkest Dungeons, or seen Near Dark, you'll know what a horror fantasy is. Gothic is about the past coming back to haunt you. Some form of dark justice being done. But honestly, for fantasy purposes, it just means loads of bats and full moons and old castles and all that good stuff. Gothic emphasizes dread, as Cosmic emphasizes terror. Any setting with a creepy forest with a broken down castle, Goth has all that morbid and death imagery, passion, lust, desire, they're always bad, they always lead to trouble. All your baddies in Gothic horror should have huge emotions driving them. They love someone and they'll do anything to bring them back. They hate someone and they'll do anything to see them suffer. They have offended God and they feel like this incredible drive to fix things, even if that makes things worse. That's what you want in Gothic, big, overwhelming emotions. Psychological horror, they're basically in a few negative emotional states. They are sometimes called shadow emotions. Shadow emotions, sadness, anger, anxiety, embarrassment, and shame, disgust. If you experience too much of any of these emotions, it's therapy for you, my friend. Psych horror is about being forced to confront your character's sadness or anger or shame or disgust. Obviously, psychological horror is best in any games where you want to really roleplay heavily because it's all about individual experiences. Those are the best campaigns, of course, when you roleplay very, very heavily. It can be hard to do psychological horror without that sort of investment because you've got to have the emotions of your character, and if you don't have a team of players who really like to get into their characters, psychological horror might not really be the best way to go. In horror terms, something like a mind flayer making experience your worst memories over and over. A doppelganger learns what disgusts you personally. It's in your life. It has your memories. It knows what grosses you out. The same way we've got, the same way anyone has like no, I don't like that. I don't like the ocean. I don't like holes in things. I'm afraid of people with red hair. That sort of stuff. Those individual dreads. Clowns. It's always clowns. And lastly, for this video at least, is splatterpunk. All these horrors have horrible things happening to people, but splatterpunk focuses in on violence. Splatterpunk is about someone doing this to you. In body horror, you might get your skin melted off after a curse from a tomb melts your skin off. Splatterpunk wants to show someone melting your skin off. From people, from animals, from monsters, it doesn't matter. It just wants to have violence. Just wants to have pain, and it just wants to have, this is the keyword, injury. You know what I mean? I think psychological horror is where it's at. I love the props of the Gothic. I'm a big sucker for a vampire lord in a blouse and fantastic hair. I mix and match though. I do psychological, so I know how to focus on what scares the character, but I tend to want to put it within a pre-existing setting, like a cosmic or a Gothic setting. Anyway, that's your first step. Decide on the focus of your fear. Then you want to do your usual regular world building and adventure design, but you want to focus around that theme of fear. So if I was doing body horror, I'd focus on a lot of creatures who are both mutated and mutating. Gothic, lots of undead, lots of werewolves, lots of night things that creep. Splatterpunk, cultists with chainsaws are good. Anything with nasty attacks, spitting acid, poison claws, something like that. So that's what you want to do. You want to sit down and go like, what creatures can I use to emphasize my kind of fear? I'd also make some locations that fit my mood and the locus for horror. Thankfully, generations of horror writers and movies by now have identified places that provoke our shadow emotions: asylums, hospitals, graveyards, battlefields, ancient ruins of beings unlike us, rooms filled with horrible things. I once had a girlfriend sneak me into the Anatomy Museum at Sydney University. All hands and heads and eyes just floating about, memorably eerie. But sometimes something as simple as dolls, especially if you just don't like that kind of animalist human figure. I personally find windmills inextricably sinister. The sounds, the slow movement, and when you're getting close up, you realize that the sails are tremendously violent. Just things like that. Just things that you know will provoke emotion. Then NPCs. Now this is where you want to have some fun. Typically you want baddies, people in league with the forces of evil, or the forces of evil themselves. Cultists, vampire mind slaves, politicians, or money men who think there's a buck to be made from exploiting this horror. Power-hungry mages who think there's power to be had from exploiting this situation. Political rivals who think of nothing of a deal with the devil. These are all good bad guys. You just want to connect them to the horror somehow. And of course, then there's your allies. They can be just as effective at creating a horror scenario. Survivors who don't want to let this horrible thing happen to anyone else. Maybe they're more extreme than your PCs. Maybe your PCs are more extreme. Wise people who've spent their lives reading about this darkness. You just want good people who wants to help, even if they won't pick up that +1 spear. And then, of course, there's the victims. These are the NPCs that you'll be free to kill. Sometimes it's just an innkeeper who's been renting your rooms, mad old hermit who's seen them at night, local night watch, local minor ability who's quite friendly to the players, whatever. And these NPCs don't always have to be likable, you know. It can be really satisfying if some local dickhead who your PCs think is a massive bellend, if that person ends up in someone's belly, you know, there is catharsis in horror games as well. The important thing, though, is that you want the NPCs to be important to the PCs, or when they die, it's not going to matter that much. So you really do want to take some time to make a strong cast for your horror game. So you've got the monsters you want to use. You've got your location ready to be attacked and suffer horror. So, you know, like you've got a town ready for brainworms, or a colony somewhere that's being attacked by ghosts, or all the shadows are all killing them, or whatever. You've got a good cast of characters, and you know who you're going to kill, and you know who's going to suffer, and you know all that sort of stuff about them. That's up for a good start. But there's one final thing I want to talk about, which is the different kinds of fear. Because when we start off with a horror game, you want to start off with terror, because terror is about knowing something bad is likely to happen. Terror is the word we have for the feeling you experience between knowing the bad is on the way and the dreaded moment when that bad arrives. And sometimes it's just atmosphere, creaking floorboards, scratching at the doors, footsteps in the attic. Typically, ghost stories are more about terror. You want to ratchet up the mood, raising the pressure. Go slow, then go fast. Bang! In comes the werewolf. That's role-playing terror. That moment before the werewolf kicks in the door. But what comes after is horror. Horror is about fear and disgust. If your horror focuses on physical injury or defamation, or a really gross monster, or having to put your hand inside a beehive full of bees and the bees all have knives or something, that is horror. That moment of, oh my god, it's here and it's disgusting and bad things are happening to me. I think the terror is more important, but there is something fun to be said for just horrible things happening to the PCs. And also, you've got to remember that sometimes players love when their PCs suffer a grisly or ghoulish fate. Now we're going to do adventures next time, because that's also key to doing horror fantasy. I am just about to jump on a plane and go on holidays for a little while, my first about 7 years, so I can't do the 2 videos back to back this time. But I hope you enjoyed this. What I'd really like now is for you to tell me about your experiences with horror fantasy. What's a setting that you like? What's a game that you've already played in? What's a campaign that you've run or experienced? What's a scary villain that you faced? One that really gave you the heebie-jeebies? I would love to hear about that stuff. And while you're there, why not give my little video a like? Because otherwise the algorithm never notices me. Alright, I love you guys. See you soon.